They left a dead German Shepherd puppy at a campout, but a stray cat did the unthinkable. Whiskers wasn't an ordinary stray cat. Veterans of Pinecrest often spotted the battle-scarred orange tabby prowling the outskirts of their annual summer retreat, a testament to nature's resilience in the face of abandonment. His left ear was partially missing and a jagged scar ran across his right eye, giving him a perpetually wary expression. Despite these markers of a difficult life, his amber eyes remained sharp and calculating, constantly assessing his surroundings with the precision of a seasoned tactician. The locals at Whispering Pines National Forest had given him various names. Over the years, Rusty Ginger Scout, but the veterans who frequented Campsite 17 had settled on Whiskers after noticing his unusually long facial bristles that twitched with heightened sensitivity. Some of the older vets claimed those whiskers could detect changes in barometric pressure before the most sophisticated weather instruments. A tall tale that grew more elaborate with each retelling around evening campfires. This particular morning, Whiskers was perched on a sun-warmed boulder overlooking Campsite 17, his tail swishing methodically as he observed the aftermath of the Veterans Memorial Weekend gathering. The event had drawn dozens of former service members from across 3 states, their laughter and occasional 1,000-yard stares equally familiar to the watchful feline. These humans were different from the weekend hikers and raucous teenagers who sometimes ventured into his territory. They moved differently, deliberately, eyes constantly scanning tree lines, many startling at sudden noises, while others seemed unnaturally still in moments of silence. Whiskers understood vigilance. It was the universal language of survivors. The campsite below now lay abandoned. Tents struck and vehicles departed as the morning fog still clung to the pine-laden hillsides. Whiskers had learned the rhythms of these gatherings, the arrival, the controlled chaos, the inevitable food scraps that made such human congregations worth his attention, and finally, the departure that returned his territory to its natural state. His whiskers twitched as he detected a subtle change in the air pressure. Rain would arrive by evening. After allowing sufficient time to ensure the humans had truly departed, Whiskers descended from his lookout point, his movements fluid and deliberate. Each paw placement was carefully considered, a habit developed. Through years of navigating unpredictable terrain, the campground still held the lingering sense of coffee, bacon, and the peculiar smokiness that clung to these particular humans. Cigarettes. Mixed with memories of distant desert fires and machinery oil, the campsite offered modest rewards for his patience. Half a hot dog bun near the fire pit, a piece of beef jerky caught between stones, and several chips scattered where folding chairs had created indentations in the soil. Whiskers consumed these treasures methodically, his survival instincts never allowing him to fully lower his guard, even during this small feast. His ears remained alert, rotating independently to catalog the ambient sounds of the forest. The chatter of squirrels, the distant calls of hawks, and the rustling of leaves in the gentle morning breeze. As Whiskers finished the last morsel, a sound caught his attention, distinctive yet out of place in the forest's usual symphony. His head snapped toward the perimeter of the campsite, ears forward, and whiskers extended to their full sensitivity. The sound came again, a barely perceptible whimper, so faint it might have been imagined. For most cats, such a sound might trigger predatory instincts or cautious retreat. But Whiskers' experiences had cultivated an unusual intuition. The veterans who sometimes extended hands with offerings had taught him that weakness didn't always signal danger or opportunity. Sometimes it signaled need. The whimper originated from beyond the main campsite, near a small ravine where campers occasionally disposed of their trash, despite the posted regulations. Whiskers moved toward the sound, his body low to the ground, ready to retreat at this first sign of threat. The gentle slope was dotted with pine needles and small rocks that shifted under his weight as he navigated the increasingly steep terrain. The whimpering grew slightly more distinct as he approached, not the sound of typical forest prey, but something larger, more complex in its vocalization. It conveyed pain and fear in a way that resonated with something deep in Whiskers' feline brain, triggering memories from his own kittenhood before he'd learned the harsh lessons of survival. As he crested the small ridge overlooking the ravine, the source of the sound became visible, and Whiskers froze, his muscles tensing with instinctive caution. Below, partially concealed by fallen branches and what appeared to be a deliberately placed tarp, lay the unmistakable form of a dog, a puppy, hardly more than a few months old. Its coat was meant to be the rich black and tan characteristic of German shepherds, but was now matted with mud, pine needles, and what Whiskers' keen nose identified as blood. The puppy's breathing was labored, each exhale accompanied by that pitiful whimper that had drawn the cat's attention. One of its hind legs was bent at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, though open, seemed unfocused and clouded with pain. Whiskers observed from his vantage point conflicting instincts battling within him. Dogs were threats, competitors at best, predators at worst, yet this one was incapacitated, abandoned, and radiating the unmistakable scent of approaching death. The rational response would be to leave, to allow nature's efficient cycle to continue uninterrupted. The strong survived, the weak perished. It was the law that governed Whiskers' existence since being abandoned as a kitten near the ranger station 7 years ago. The puppy's eyes suddenly focused, somehow sensing Whiskers' presence despite its weakened state. Their gazes met across the small ravine, amber feline eyes locking with the deep brown of the shepherd. The puppy's tail moved, not a wag, merely a twitch of recognition, and another whimper escaped its muzzle, this one somehow different. It wasn't fear of the cat. It was recognition of another living being in its final moments. Something shifted in Whiskers' usually pragmatic assessment of the situation. Perhaps it was the unusual stillness of the forest, or the memory of gentle hands that sometimes offered him food at this very campsite. Perhaps it was something more primal, a recognition across species lines of abandoned to abandoned, survivor to survivor. Whiskers descended into the ravine, each step deliberate but no longer cautious. The puppy watched his approach, too weak to show either fear or hope. As Whiskers drew closer, the extent of the puppy's condition became clearer. Beyond the broken leg, its body was covered in small wounds, the distinctive marks of both human cruelty and subsequent animal attacks. The tarp had only partially protected it from opportunistic forest scavengers during the night. The morning, sunlight filtering through the pine canopy, created dappled patterns across the puppy's dirty coat as Whiskers circled it cautiously. The cat's sensitive nose detected infection setting in on several of the wounds. Without intervention, the puppy would not survive another night, might not even survive until sunset. This close, Whiskers could see the puppy wore no collar, no tags, no identification of any kind. It had been deliberately abandoned, likely by someone from the veterans gathering who couldn't or wouldn't care for it any longer. Whiskers had witnessed similar abandonments over the years. Unwanted kittens in boxes, aging hunting dogs left tied to trees, even exotic pets like turtles, and birds released into environments that would inevitably kill them. Humans often discarded what they no longer valued. The puppy's breathing had become more labored, its eyes struggling to remain open. Death was approaching, patient but inevitable. Whiskers sat down beside the puppy, just beyond reaching distance, and began to groom himself, a normal behavior in an abnormal situation. The rhythmic motion seemed to capture the puppy's attention, its eyes tracking the cat's methodical movements. Unexpectedly, Whiskers detected a new scent carried on the shifting breeze. Human, accompanied by the distinctive odor of cigarettes, gun oil, and the medicinal smell he associated with the older veterans. Someone was approaching the campsite long after the others had departed. The sound of labored breathing, human this time, confirmed Whiskers' assessment. Heavy footsteps crunched through the undergrowth, accompanied by the rhythmic tapping of what Whiskers recognized as a walking stick or cane. The cat's instincts urged immediate retreat, but the puppy's condition anchored him to the spot, caught in an uncharacteristic moment of indecision. The footsteps halted at the edge of the main campsite. "Hello?" a gruff voice called out. "Forgot my damn medication. Un case. Anyone still here?" Silence answered the voice, broken only by the puppy's increasingly faint whimpering. Whiskers remained motionless, his amber eyes fixed on the ridge above where the human voice had originated. "Thought everyone was gone," the voice muttered, followed by the sound of movement as the human explored the abandoned campsite. "Could've sworn I left it by the fire pit." The puppy's next whimper came louder, a particularly sharp pain, causing it to vocalize with more strength than before. The sound echoed slightly in the small ravine. The human footsteps paused. What the hell was that? More footsteps, now moving cautiously toward the ravine's edge. Whiskers had seconds to decide: flee and preserve his own safety, or remain beside the dying puppy and risk confrontation with an unpredictable human. Self-preservation had always guided his decisions, had kept him alive through winters and droughts, through coyote encounters and territorial disputes with other strays. Yet he remained seated beside the German shepherd puppy, his tail twitching with tension, but his position unmoved. "Jesus Christ!" The human voice came closer as a figure appeared at the ravine's edge. "Is that a dog down there?" The figure navigated the slope with difficulty, the walking stick providing necessary support on the uneven terrain. As the human came into clearer view, Whiskers recognized one of the older veterans, a tall man with a silver beard and a pronounced limp, wearing the same olive-green cap many of the veterans favored. The man spotted Whiskers and halted, his dissent, surprise evident in his weathered features. "Well, I'll be damned. What have we got here?" "Easy there, little tiger," the man said softly, using his walking stick to maintain balance as he carefully navigated the remaining distance down the ravine. Whiskers arched his back slightly, fur bristling with instinctive caution, but he held his ground beside the injured puppy. The man's name was James Whitaker, though everyone at the veterans' retreat knew him simply as Sergeant. At 67, his imposing frame still carried the disciplined posture of his 30 years in the army, despite the titanium rod in his right leg, a permanent souvenir from his final deployment to Afghanistan. The prosthetic left foot hidden beneath his pant leg, and inside his specially designed hiking boot, explained his distinctive gait and reliance on the handcrafted oak walking stick. James had driven nearly 3 hours back to Whispering Pines after realizing he'd left behind the small leather case containing his heart medication. The VA wouldn't refill the prescription early, and he couldn't afford to purchase it out of pocket. That forgetfulness, increasingly common these days, had frustrated him during the entire drive back, each mile accompanied by self-directed muttering about getting too damn old for this nonsense. Now, all thoughts of medication vanished as he surveyed the scene before him, a critically injured German shepherd puppy and a battle-scarred orange tabby standing guard beside it. "What happened to you, little one?" James murmured, his voice dropping to the gentle tone he'd once used with frightened civilians and wounded soldiers alike. He carefully lowered himself to a kneeling position, his prosthetic foot sliding slightly on the uneven ground before he stabilized himself with his walking stick. The puppy's breathing had grown more labored, its eyes unfocused with pain and dehydration. James recognized the signs of shock from countless battlefield assessments. Without immediate intervention, the animal wouldn't survive much longer. His weathered face hardened as he noticed the distinctive marks on the puppy's body, cigarette burns on its flank, what appeared to be boot marks on its rib cage, and the deliberately broken leg. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice barely, masking controlled fury. His experienced eyes catalogued the injuries, noting their deliberate pattern. This wasn't an accident or the result of natural predators. This was intentional cruelty, followed by calculated abandonment. Whiskers studied the human intently, Whiskers twitching as he processed the man's scent and demeanor. Unlike many humans who radiated unpredictable energy, this one moved with careful precision. His voice maintained a consistent, measured tone that reminded Whiskers of the forest rangers who occasionally left food near the maintenance shed, humans who understood boundaries and respect. James glanced at the orange tabby, noting its protective posture beside the puppy. "And what's your story, old-timer? You standing guard here?" As if understanding the question, Whiskers blinked slowly, then deliberately licked one paw, maintaining eye contact with James. The casual grooming gesture while remaining firmly positioned between James and the puppy communicated volumes to the veteran, who had learned to read body language across countless cultural divides during his military career. "I mean no harm," James said, slowly reaching into his jacket pocket. Whiskers tensed but didn't retreat. James extracted a small packet of beef jerky, his standard hiking snack. He tore off a small piece and placed it on the ground between them, then shifted backward to create more distance. The offering established a momentary truce. Whiskers cautiously approached the jerky, sniffed it thoroughly, then delicately consumed it while maintaining visual awareness of both James and the puppy. This small acceptance of food seemed to establish a tentative trust. "Now for the little one," James murmured. He reached toward his canteen, his movements deliberately telegraphed to avoid startling the cat. The puppy needed water desperately, but its position made drinking difficult. James cupped his hand, poured a small amount of water into his palm, and cautiously extended it toward the puppy's muzzle. The puppy made a feeble attempt to drink, its tongue barely able to lap at the offered water. Most spilled uselessly onto the ground. James frowned, concern deepening the lines around his eyes. "You need more help than I can give you here, little soldier." He assessed their location, mentally calculating the distance back to his truck and then to the nearest veterinary clinic, at least 45 minutes away in Millridge. The puppy needed to be moved, but its injuries required careful handling. James removed his olive green jacket, preparing to create a makeshift stretcher. Throughout these preparations, Whiskers observed with unwavering attention, his tail occasionally twitching with nervous energy, but his position remaining steadfast beside the puppy. The cat's behavior continued to intrigue James, who had witnessed countless examples of animal intelligence during his global deployments, but rarely such cross-species concern. "I need to move this pup to get help," James explained, addressing the cat directly. His years of solitude had eliminated any self-consciousness about talking to animals. "You're welcome to follow if you want, but don't get in my way." As James carefully slid his jacket beneath the injured puppy, the animal yelped weakly, the movement aggravating its broken leg. Whiskers' ears flattened at the sound, his muscles tensing visibly. James froze, allowing the puppy a moment to adjust, before continuing his careful maneuvering. "Easy, easy," he soothed, his large hands surprisingly gentle as they cradled the small animal. "I know it hurts, soldier. Hang in there." With the puppy now wrapped securely in his jacket, James faced a new challenge, navigating the ravine's steep slope while carrying the injured animal and managing his own mobility limitations. His prosthetic foot wasn't designed for this terrain, and his right leg had already begun aching from the unusual strain. James secured his walking stick through a belt loop, freeing both hands to cradle the puppy against his chest. He studied the incline, planning each step mentally before beginning his ascent. The first few steps went smoothly, his years of adapting to physical challenges evident in his methodical approach. Halfway up the slope, disaster struck. A patch of loose soil gave way beneath his prosthetic foot, causing James to lurch sideways. He instinctively tightened his grip on the puppy while attempting to regain balance, but momentum worked against him. James felt himself beginning to fall. The puppy clutched protectively against his chest. In that critical moment, a streak of orange fur shot past him. Whiskers had bolted up the slope and now stood directly in James's path, creating a visual focal point. The veteran instinctively adjusted his weight distribution, using the cat's position as a reference to reorient himself. His prosthetic foot found solid purchase, and he regained his balance, the puppy still secure in his grasp. James exhaled shakily, looking down at the orange tabby that had now calmly sat down on the path ahead of him. "Thanks for the assist, Sergeant Cat," he said with a wry smile, acknowledging the animal's seemingly deliberate intervention. The remainder of the ascent proceeded without incident, Whiskers staying several paces ahead, occasionally looking back, as if monitoring their progress. When they reached level ground, James paused to catch his breath and reassess the puppy's condition. Its breathing remained shallow, but its eyes had reopened, feebly tracking movement. "My truck's about a quarter mile." "That way," James said, nodding toward a dirt access road barely visible through the trees. He glanced down at Whiskers, who sat watching him with unblinking amber eyes. "I'm taking this little one to the vet in Millridge. You're welcome to come along or go back to your territory. Your choice." James began walking toward his vehicle, the weight of the puppy and the uneven terrain making his progress slow and methodical. Behind him, he heard the soft padding of paws as Whiskers followed at a discreet distance. The cat maintained this calculated proximity, close enough to monitor the puppy, but far enough to retreat if necessary. The journey to James's battered Ford pickup took nearly 20 minutes, each step carefully measured to avoid jostling the injured puppy. When they finally reached the vehicle, James gently placed the wrapped puppy on the passenger seat before opening the glove compartment to retrieve his forgotten medication case. "There you are, you little troublemaker," he muttered to the case, pocketing it before returning his attention to the puppy. He arranged his jacket to create a more stable nest, then closed the passenger door and circled around to the driver's side. As he opened his door, he spotted Whiskers sitting perfectly still beside the truck, amber eyes fixed on the vehicle's interior where the puppy lay. James hesitated, one foot already inside the cab. The rational decision was to leave now, get the puppy to medical attention, as quickly as possible. The cat would return to its territory, resume its solitary existence, yet something about the intensity of the cat's gaze, the deliberate way it had followed them through difficult terrain, gave James pause. During his decades of military service, he'd learned to trust instincts that defied logical explanation. "You really care about this pup, don't you?" James asked softly. Whiskers blinked slowly, then deliberately stood and approached the truck, stopping directly beside James's boot. With a resigned sigh that masked unexpected emotion, James reached down and carefully lifted the orange tabby. "Don't make me regret this," he warned, as he placed Whiskers on the driver's side floor. "And don't you dare mess with my pedals while I'm driving." The cat immediately moved to the center console, positioning himself where he could maintain visual contact with the puppy without interfering with James's driving. The arrangement struck James as so deliberately intentional that he found himself chuckling despite the gravity of the situation. 30 years in special forces, and here I am, chauffeur to a stray cat and a dying puppy, he muttered, turning the key in the ignition. "Getting soft in my old age." The truck's engine roared too, life startling Whiskers momentarily before the cat resettled into its vigilant posture. James carefully backed onto the dirt road and began the drive toward Millridge. his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel with renewed purpose. As they pulled away from Whispering Pines National Forest, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising the approaching storm that Whiskers had sensed hours earlier. The first raindrops began to fall against the windshield, nature's rhythm providing a counterpoint to the labored breathing of the injured puppy and the steady determination of the unlikely trio, now bound together by circumstance and choice. The rain intensified as James navigated the winding mountain roads leading away from Whispering Pines. His wipers struggled against the downpour, creating brief moments of clarity before the windshield was once again obscured by sheets of water. The forest canopy that had previously filtered sunlight now dripped relentlessly, creating a tunnel of grey through which the old Ford pickup rumbled cautiously. "Road's going to wash out if this keeps up," James muttered, leaning forward slightly as he peered through the rain-streaked glass. His prosthetic foot applied careful pressure to the brake pedal as they approached a particularly sharp turn. Had enough flash floods in these mountains to last a lifetime. Whiskers remained vigilant on the center console, his body swaying slightly, with each curve in the road, but his attention unwavering from the puppy. The German Shepherd had fallen into a state of semi-consciousness, its breathing shallow and irregular. The jacket James had wrapped around it was now damp with a mixture of rain and what appeared to be blood from reopened wounds. The veterinary clinic in Millridge represented the puppy's best hope for survival, but James harbored growing concerns about whether they would arrive in time. He glanced at his watch, nearly noon. Dr. Calloway's small practice maintained limited weekend hours, closing at 1 p.m. on Saturdays. Time was becoming as critical an element as the puppy's deteriorating condition. A large branch suddenly crashed onto the road ahead, carried by a gust of wind from the storm-tossed forest. James reacted instantly, decades of combat driving experience taking over as he skillfully maneuvered around the obstacle without fully stopping the vehicle. The abrupt maneuver caused the puppy to slide slightly on the seat, eliciting a weak whimper of pain. Before James could reach over to stabilize the puppy, Whiskers leapt from the console and positioned himself against the small animal, bracing it against further movement. The cat's body formed a living barrier between the puppy and the edge of the seat, his muscles tensed to absorb the truck's motion. "Good thinking, Sergeant Cat," James acknowledged, genuinely impressed by the animal's problem-solving abilities. The rain pounded harder against the roof of the pickup, creating a cacophonous backdrop to the increasingly tense journey. The mountain road eventually connected with Route 27, a two-lane highway that would take them directly into Millridge. Under normal conditions, they would reach town in 20 minutes, but the deluge had reduced visibility and created dangerous driving conditions that demanded caution. Other vehicles on the road had their headlights on despite the midday hour, appearing as ghostly shapes through the curtain of rain. James reached for his phone, intending to call ahead to the veterinary clinic, only to find the device's battery completely drained. "Perfect," he muttered, tossing the useless phone onto the dashboard. He would have to hope that Dr. Calloway was still accepting patients when they arrived. A flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The proximity suggested the storm was directly overhead, intensifying rather than passing through. Whiskers flinched at the sound, but remained positioned protectively beside the puppy. "Not a fan of thunder, huh?" James observed, noting the cat's flattened ears and slightly puffed tail. "Can't say I blame you. Spent enough time in artillery range to last several lifetimes." This casual conversation seemed to soothe both man and cat as they continued their rain-lashed journey toward Millridge. James found himself relying on the solidarity of shared purpose with this unexpected feline companion, a feeling remarkably similar to the bonds formed during high-stress military operations. As they approached the town limits, the rain began to slacken slightly, offering improved visibility of Millridge's modest skyline. The small mountain community consisted primarily of two-story buildings constructed in the early 1900s, their brick facades and wide awnings reflecting the architectural style of a bygone era. Main Street would lead them directly past Dr. Calloway's veterinary practice, nestled between the hardware store and Millridge's only pharmacy. James guided the truck through puddle-strewn streets, noting with growing concern that many of the businesses already had their closed signs displayed. The storm had apparently prompted an early shutdown across town, with residents preferring the safety of home to the uncertainty of flooded roads and potential power outages. The dashboard clock read 12:42 p.m. as they pulled into the small parking lot beside Calloway Veterinary Services. The modest single-story building featured a hand-painted sign and window displays of pet care products. Through the rain-speckled glass, James could see lights still on inside, a promising sign that Dr. Calloway hadn't yet departed for the day. "We made it," James said, exhaling with relief as he shifted the truck into park. He turned to assess the puppy, gently pulling back a corner of his jacket. The animal's condition had deteriorated further during the journey, its breathing now alarmingly shallow and irregular. "Hang on, little soldier. Help's just inside." He turned his attention to Whiskers, who sat watching him expectantly, as if awaiting instructions. "I'm going to carry the pup inside. You can come if you want, but they might not allow it." James spoke matter-of-factly, having abandoned any self-consciousness about conversing with the cat. "Your choice, Sergeant." Without waiting for the impossible response, James carefully gathered the jacket-wrapped puppy in his arms and pushed open the driver's side door. The rain had diminished to a steady drizzle, but the wind remained fierce, whipping around the corner of the building and sending a spray of cold droplets against his face. He used his shoulder to hold the door open a moment longer, providing Whiskers an opportunity to exit if the cat chose to do so. To his mild surprise, Whiskers leapt from the console to the driver's seat and then to the wet pavement, landing with practiced precision. The cat shook each paw individually, a fastidious gesture that struck James as incongruously dignified given their urgent circumstances, before following him toward the clinic's entrance. James shouldered open the door, a small bell announcing their arrival. The reception area was empty, except for a young woman behind the counter, already wearing her rain jacket and clearly preparing to leave. "I'm sorry, sir, we're about to close," she began, then stopped abruptly as she registered the bundle in James's arms and the bedraggled orange cat at his heels. "Oh my goodness, what happened? Found this pup abandoned at Whispering Pines," James explained rapidly. "It's in bad shape. Broken leg, possible internal injuries, deliberate abuse from the looks of it. Needs immediate attention." The receptionist, Namitag identified her as Jenny, immediately dropped her preparations for departure and reached for the phone. "I'll get Dr. Calloway right away. He was just finishing up with his last scheduled patient." While Jenny made the call, James carefully placed the puppy on a bench in the waiting area, adjusting the jacket to provide better support for the broken leg. Whiskers immediately jumped up beside the puppy, positioning himself in the same protective stance he had maintained in the truck. Jenny hung up the phone and approached, her professional demeanor tempered with genuine concern as she assessed the puppy's condition. "Dr. Calloway will be right out. He'll need some information for our records." She handed James a clipboard with several forms attached. "Fill out what you can, but don't worry about the insurance section if you don't have any." James accepted the clipboard with a nod of thanks, though his attention remained primarily on the puppy. He'd seen enough battlefield trauma to recognize the signs of critical condition, and the puppy's shallow breathing and unresponsive state suggested they had arrived dangerously close to too late. "Is that cat with you?" Jenny asked, noticing Whiskers' protective positioning. In a manner of speaking, James replied, "He found the puppy first, actually. Been standing guard over it since before I arrived." Jenny's expression softened with surprise. That's unusual behavior for a stray cat, especially around an injured dog. He's an unusual cat, James said simply, beginning to fill out the forms with his personal information. He hesitated at the field marked pet's name, realizing he hadn't considered this detail until now. After a moment's reflection, he wrote Scout, a name that seemed fitting for the small German shepherd who had survived against considerable odds. A door at the rear of the reception area opened, and a man in his 50s wearing a white lab coat emerged. Dr. Calloway's salt and pepper beard and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an appropriately scholarly appearance, though the rolled-up sleeves and forearm tattoo hinting beneath the cuff suggested a less conventional background. Let's see what we've got here, Dr. Calloway said, immediately moving to examine the puppy. His experienced hands moved gently but efficiently over the small body, assessing vital signs and areas of injury. Jenny, prep exam room 2 and call Melissa. Tell her we need emergency assistance. He glanced up at James. German Shepherd mix, approximately 3 to 4 months old, severe trauma and dehydration. How long has it been like this? Unknown, James replied, adopting the concise reporting style ingrained from his military years. Found it approximately 90 minutes ago at Whispering Pines. Evidence suggests deliberate abuse, followed by abandonment, possibly overnight exposure. Dr. Calloway nodded grimly, his expression hardening slightly at the mention of abuse. We'll need to act quickly. Broken hind leg, possible rib fractures, signs of internal bleeding, and what appears to be the beginning stages of shock. He carefully lifted the puppy, still wrapped in James' jacket. I'll take Scout back for immediate treatment. Jenny will help you with the paperwork and discuss potential costs. As Dr. Calloway began to carry Scout toward the examination room, Whiskers suddenly leapt from the bench and attempted to follow. Jenny moved to intercept the cat, but Dr. Calloway paused, studying Whiskers with professional curiosity. You mentioned this cat was guarding the puppy? He asked James. Affirmative. Found them together. Cat hasn't left the pup's side since, even followed us all the way from Whispering Pines. Dr. Calloway considered this information, then made an unusual decision. The cat can come back to the exam room. Sometimes animals in distress respond better with familiar presences nearby. Jenny, get a small carrier ready in case we need to separate them. But for now, let's see how this plays out. Whiskers, as if understanding the reprieve, followed Dr. Calloway at a respectful distance as they disappeared through the door to the treatment area. James found himself alone with Jenny in the reception area, the clipboard of incomplete forms still in his hand. That's highly unusual, Jenny commented, watching the door swing shut behind the unlikely trio. Dr. Calloway normally doesn't allow unauthorized animals in the treatment areas. Strict about contamination protocols. James nodded, understanding the significance of the exception. Special circumstances call for adaptable protocols, he said, a philosophy that had served him well throughout his military career. Jenny returned to her desk, indicating a chair where James could complete the paperwork. Just to prepare you, she said gently, based on what I observed, that puppy's condition is quite serious. Dr. Calloway will do everything possible, but you should be aware that emergency treatment for injuries this severe can become expensive. Do you have a budget in mind, or would you like information about our payment plans? The question jolted James back to practical reality. His fixed income from military retirement and disability benefits covered his modest lifestyle, but left little room for unexpected expenses. The medication he'd driven back to retrieve cost nearly $200 per month, even with his VA benefits, a financial strain he managed through careful budgeting. He hadn't considered the potential cost when he'd impulsively decided to rescue Scout. His decision had been driven by the moral imperative to help a suffering creature, not by financial calculations. Now, faced with the prospect of potentially significant veterinary bills, James experienced a moment of doubt. "What's the typical cost range for this type of emergency treatment?" he asked, his voice deliberately neutral. Jenny's expression conveyed sympathetic understanding. "For the initial emergency stabilization, probably 600, 800. If surgery is required for the broken leg, that could add another $1,500 to $2,000. Then there's recovery care, medication, follow-up visits." She trailed off, recognizing the gravity, settling into James's features. "We do work with several rescue organizations that might be able to help with costs, especially in cases of abuse. I can provide contact information while Dr. Calloway assesses Scout's condition." James nodded, his weathered hands tightening slightly around the clipboard. The responsible choice would be to authorize only the minimum treatment necessary to stabilize Scout, then transfer responsibility to a rescue organization or the county animal shelter. The financially prudent path was clear, yet as he sat in the sterile reception area, the sound of rain drumming steadily on the roof overhead, James found himself unable to commit to that logical course of action. The image of Whiskers, standing, guard over the dying puppy, the cat's unwavering dedication, despite natural instincts that should have driven it away, had affected him more deeply than he cared to admit. "Cost isn't my primary concern right now," James heard himself saying. "Do whatever Scout needs. I'll figure out the finances." Jenny's smile reflected genuine appreciation for his decision. "I'll let Dr. Calloway know, and I'll still gather information about assistance programs. There's no reason you should shoulder this entire burden alone, especially since you're the one who stepped up to help when others didn't." As Jenny disappeared into the treatment area, James leaned back in the uncomfortable plastic chair and closed his eyes briefly. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the discovery and emergency journey was beginning to fade, leaving fatigue in its wake. His prosthetic leg ached from the unusual exertion, and the damp chill of his rain-soaked clothing had settled into his bones. Yet beneath the physical discomfort lay a curious sense of purpose that had been absent from his life for longer than he cared to acknowledge. The solitary existence he'd constructed since retiring from active duty suddenly seemed less like the peaceful retreat he'd envisioned, and more like a gradual withdrawal from meaningful engagement with the world. Perhaps Whiskers wasn't the only one who had made an unexpected choice today. The waiting room clock ticked methodically, marking nearly 2 hours since Dr. Calloway had taken Scout into the treatment area. James had completed the paperwork, drunk 3 cups of mediocre coffee from the clinic's ancient machine, and paced the small reception area enough times that he could identify every crack in the linoleum flooring. Jenny had left after the first hour, replaced by a night receptionist named Marcus, who seemed more interested in his textbook, Advanced Organic Chemistry, than in providing updates to the increasingly restless veteran. Outside, the storm continued unabated, occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the parking lot where James's truck sat alone. The town of Millridge had largely shut down for the evening, storefront lights extinguished and streets deserted in the face of the relentless weather. "You can go home if you want," Marcus offered without looking up from his studying. "We can call you when there's news." James shook his head, settling back into the uncomfortable plastic chair. "I'll wait," he replied simply. The dead cell phone in his pocket made the offer impractical anyway, though James would have declined regardless. Military discipline had taught him the value of maintaining position until mission completion. The door to the treatment area finally swung open at 7:42 p.m., revealing an exhausted-looking Dr. Calloway. His scrubs bore evidence of the battle fought, small bloodstains and antiseptic splashes creating a constellation of marks across the blue fabric. Behind him, a young woman in similar attire, presumably Melissa, the assistant he had called, emerged carrying a clipboard of her own. James immediately straightened, reading the veterinarian's expression with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to receiving battlefield assessments. The absence of defeat in Dr. Calloway's demeanor provided the first glimmer of hope since their arrival. "Scout is stable," Dr. Calloway announced without preamble, understanding the priority of information. It was touch and go for a while. He encoded once during initial treatment, but we managed to resuscitate. The next 24-48 hours will be critical, but he's fighting. Relief washed through James, unexpectedly intense. "Thank you, Doctor," he said, the simple words carrying the weight of genuine gratitude. Dr. Calloway nodded acknowledgement before continuing with his assessment. The injuries were extensive and deliberate. Broken tibia, 3 fractured ribs, punctured lung, significant internal bleeding, and multiple contusions consistent with blunt force trauma. There are also burn marks that appear to be from cigarettes and evidence of prolonged malnutrition. Each item in the litany of abuse strengthened James's determination to identify those responsible, a familiar cold anger settling in his chest. Military intelligence had taught him to catalog details methodically, and he mentally filed away each injury as potential evidence. "We've set the leg using external fixation pins," Dr. Calloway continued, gesturing to Melissa's clipboard where diagrams illustrated the procedure. "The lung has been reinflated, and we've started antibiotics to prevent infection from setting in. Scout is currently sedated and will remain so overnight to manage pain and prevent movement that could aggravate the injuries." "Prognosis?" James asked, the clinical term feeling strange in his mouth when applied to the small puppy that had appeared in his life just hours earlier. Dr. Calloway sighed, removing his glasses to rub tired eyes. Guardedly optimistic. He's young, which works in his favor. The blood loss was significant but not catastrophic. Assuming no complications develop overnight, I'd give him a 60% chance of survival, potentially higher if he continues. To demonstrate the same fighting spirit, a hint of admiration colored his professional assessment. "He's got remarkable tenacity for such a young animal." "And the cat?" James inquired, realizing he hadn't seen Whiskers since they'd entered the treatment area. Dr. Calloway's expression shifted to one of professional bemusement. "That's perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of this entire case. During treatment, we attempted to place the cat in a holding carrier for everyone's safety, standard protocol when a stranger animal is present. He became so distressed that Scout's vitals actually destabilized in response. We eventually allowed the cat to remain on a nearby counter where he could maintain visual contact with Scout throughout the procedures. He never interfered, never attempted to approach the surgical field, just maintained this watchful presence." The veterinarian shook his head slightly, clinical experience warring with the unusual reality he had witnessed. "I've practiced veterinary medicine for 27 years, Mr. Whitaker, and I've never seen interspecies bonding quite like this, especially between natural adversaries like cats and dogs. It's behaviorally anomalous." "Where is Whiskers now?" James asked, using the name he'd mentally assigned to the orange tabby. "Currently in the recovery kennel with Scout," Dr. Calloway replied. "We created a special arrangement, Scout in a heated kennel with monitoring equipment, and your cat on a blanket we placed atop the kennel where he can maintain visual contact. He's refused food and water so far, though we've provided both." James didn't bother correcting the assumption of ownership. In some inexplicable way, he, Whiskers, and Scout had become a unit. Roles and relationships still undefined, but connections undeniably formed. "May I see them?" he requested. Dr. Calloway hesitated, weighing medical protocols against human compassion. "Briefly," he conceded. "Scout needs undisturbed rest, but I suspect seeing you might help settle the cat. He's been vigilant since your separation." James followed Dr. Calloway through a series of doors into the recovery area. A room lined with kennels of various sizes, most empty at this late hour. The steady beep of monitoring equipment provided a rhythmic backdrop to the soft lighting, designed to simulate dusk for the animal patients. In the largest kennel, Scout lay on his side, the complex external fixation device supporting his broken leg resembling a miniature erector set of metal pins and stabilizing bars. Bandages wrapped his torso, stabilizing the fractured ribs, while an IV line delivered fluids and medication to combat shock and infection. Despite these intimidating medical interventions, the puppy's chest rose and fell with encouraging regularity, each breath stronger than those James had witnessed in the ravine. Atop the kennel, Whiskers sat in sphinx position, amber eyes fixed on Scout with unwavering attention. The cat's ears rotated toward James and Dr. Calloway as they approached, but his gaze remained locked on the puppy below. "He hasn't moved from that position since we placed Scout in recovery," Dr. Calloway remarked quietly. "Refused food, water, even a litter box. My technician Melissa tried to coax him down with tuna, usually irresistible to cats, but he wouldn't budge." James approached slowly, extending his hand palm up toward Whiskers in a non-threatening gesture. The cat finally shifted his attention from Scout, blinking slowly at James in what experts often described as the feline equivalent of a greeting or show of trust. "You did good, Sergeant," James said softly. "At ease. I've got the watch now." To Dr. Calloway's evident surprise, Whiskers responded to these words by stretching and then deliberately lying down on top of the kennel, his body still positioned to observe Scout, but his vigilant posture relaxing slightly. The cat extended one paw toward James's hand in an almost human gesture of connection. "Remarkable," Dr. Calloway murmured. "It's almost as if he understands you." James nodded, allowing Whiskers to sniff his fingers before gently scratching behind the cat's notched ear. "We understand each other," he corrected. "Different languages, same mission." After a few moments of quiet observation, Dr. Calloway guided James back to the reception area to discuss practicalities. Melissa remained behind to monitor Scout's condition and adjust medications as needed. "We'll need to keep Scout here for at least 5 days, possibly longer depending on how his recovery progresses," Dr. Calloway explained as they settled into chairs across from Marcus, who continued his studying with occasional glances at their conversation. "The external fixator will need to remain in place for approximately 6 weeks, with regular checkups to ensure proper healing and adjust as he grows." The veterinarian slid a preliminary invoice across the desk, a detailed breakdown of emergency, treatment costs, surgical procedures, medications, and projected follow-up care. The total at the bottom of the page represented nearly 2 months of James' disability benefits. "I've applied our rescue discount," Dr. Calloway noted, indicating a significant reduction in the standard fees. "And Melissa has already reached out to several organizations that might help with funding, given the abuse circumstances. The Good Shepherd Foundation in particular has a program specifically for German Shepherd rescue cases." James studied the numbers, mentally calculating adjustments to his budget that would be necessary to accommodate these expenses. He would need to defer maintenance on his truck, perhaps reduce his grocery budget, eliminate the few small luxuries he permitted himself. The financial strain would be considerable but manageable, a tactical problem requiring strategic solutions. "I appreciate the discount," James acknowledged, "and any assistance from rescue organizations would be welcome, but I'll cover whatever remains. Scout's my responsibility now." Dr. Calloway nodded, respect evident in his expression. "There's one other matter we should discuss. Prosecution of whoever did this. The injuries Scout sustained constitute felony animal cruelty in this state. With your permission, I've documented everything for potential legal action and can submit a report to Sheriff Brennan. Do you have any information about who might be responsible?" James considered the timing and location of his discovery. Scout was found at Campsite 17 in Whispering Pines. There was a veterans retreat there this weekend. About 30 former military personnel from around the region. The puppy was discovered after most had departed. He frowned, troubled by the implications. I'd like to believe none of my fellow veterans would be capable of this, but evidence suggests otherwise. The thought that someone from the military community, a brotherhood, James had devoted his life to, could inflict such deliberate cruelty disturbed him deeply. The military code that had shaped his existence emphasized protection of the vulnerable, not exploitation of weakness. "I'll provide Sheriff Brennan with that information," Dr. Calloway said, his expression grave. Animal abusers often escalate to violence against humans. Identifying them isn't just about justice for Scout. Their discussion of logistics continued. Arrangements for Scout's extended stay, medication schedules, potential rehabilitation needs. Throughout the conversation, James was acutely aware of Whiskers' continued presence in the recovery room, maintaining his self-appointed vigil over Scout. The cat's extraordinary behavior represented a commitment that transcended natural instincts. And normal animal relationships? What about Whiskers? James finally asked, using the name aloud for the first time. The cat. Will you allow him to stay with Scout? Dr. Calloway appeared momentarily surprised by the request, before his expression shifted to thoughtful consideration. "It's highly irregular from a medical standpoint," he admitted. "But given the unusual circumstances and the apparent calming effect on Scout, I'm inclined to permit it with certain precautions. We'll need to conduct a basic health screening on the cat, provide appropriate nutrition, and establish a proper relief area." Melissa has already expressed willingness to monitor both patients during her shifts. Relief washed through James at this accommodation. "Thank you. I believe their connection is important to Scout's recovery." "As do I," Dr. Calloway agreed, his scientific skepticism tempered by the evidence he had witnessed firsthand. There are documented cases of companion animals providing measurable benefits during recovery from trauma. Most involve established relationships between pets and owners, but this cross-species bond, while unusual, may serve a similar therapeutic function. The storm outside had finally begun to subside, the rhythmic drumming of rain giving way to occasional gentle tapping against the windows. Night had fully descended on Millridge, the small town settling into the quiet darkness characteristic of rural communities after business hours. "You should get some rest, Mr. Whitaker," Dr. Calloway suggested, noting the fatigue evident in James's posture. "There's a motel just down the street, the Pine Cone, that accepts veterans' discounts. Scout will be monitored continually overnight and will call immediately if his condition changes." James nodded, acknowledging both his physical exhaustion and the practical wisdom of the suggestion. He had been running on adrenaline and military discipline since discovering Scout hours earlier, and the crash was inevitable. "I'll return tomorrow morning," he said, rising stiffly from his chair. His prosthetic leg had stiffened during the long period of inactivity, requiring a moment of adjustment before he could walk normally. "Please tell Melissa I appreciate her assistance with both Scout and Whiskers." As James prepared to depart, Dr. Calloway extended his hand. "What you did today, intervening when others abandoned that puppy, speaks volumes about your character, Mr. Whitaker. Scout would have died without your intervention, and many people would have simply looked the other way." James accepted the handshake, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what needed doing, same as you." "Sometimes that's the definition of heroism," Dr. Calloway replied simply. "Doing what needs doing when others walk away." The words followed James as he stepped out into the damp night air, the storm's passage leaving behind a freshly washed world glistening under streetlights. Despite his exhaustion, Despite the financial concerns and uncertain future, a sense of rightness settled over him like a familiar weight, the comforting certainty of knowing he had fulfilled his duty as he understood it. In the recovery room, behind him, Whiskers maintained his vigilant position above Scout's kennel, two unlikely companions bound by circumstance and choice, each defying nature's expectations to forge something unexpected and profound. The Pinecone Motel exemplified small-town accommodation at its most basic. A single-story structure with 12 rooms arranged in an L shape around a gravel parking lot. The vintage neon sign flickered intermittently, casting alternating shadows, and blue-green light across James' face as he checked in. The night manager, a heavy-set man named Earl, who wore a Vietnam veteran cap, recognized James's military bearing immediately and upgraded him to a deluxe room without additional charge. "Got a microwave and a mini fridge," Earl explained, sliding a physical key across the counter. "And the shower actually has decent water pressure, unlike the standard rooms." James accepted the key with a nod of appreciation, the simple kindness of a fellow veteran, momentarily overwhelming in his exhausted state. "Thanks, probably just for tonight. Got a situation at the vet clinic I'm dealing with." Earl's expression shifted to one of understanding. "Calloway's a good man, best vet in 3 counties, fixed up my daughter's horse when everyone else said to put her down." He gestured toward a coffee maker in the corner of the small lobby. "Coffee's fresh if you need some. Military discount includes the breakfast buffet, starts at 6. The room reflected Earl's accurate description, clean and functional with the promised amenities, though the decor hadn't been updated since the early 1990s. James placed his small duffel bag on the floral bedspread and methodically unpacked the few items he'd brought for the weekend retreat. A change of clothes, toiletries, his medication, and a weathered paperback copy of Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. His evening routine had remained unchanged for years, efficient, purposeful movements honed by decades of military discipline. He removed his prosthetic leg, performed the necessary maintenance checks, and prepared for a quick shower. The familiar actions provided a sense of normalcy amidst the day's unexpected events. As hot water cascaded over his tired muscles, James found his thoughts repeatedly returning to Scout and Whiskers. The unlikelihood of their connection fascinated him. Natural enemies becoming allies through shared adversity. He recognized something of himself in both animals. Whiskers' self-reliant wariness and Scout's tenacious grip on life, despite overwhelming odds. After showering, James settled onto the bed and retrieved his medication case, carefully extracting the prescribed heart pills. The small white tablets represented both his mortality and his survival, a daily reminder of the physical toll extracted by years of operational stress and the IED explosion that had taken his leg during his final deployment. He swallowed the medication with a sip of water from the bathroom tap, grimacing slightly at the mineral taste characteristic of mountain well water. Sleep pressed heavily upon him, the adrenaline of the day's events fully depleted now that Scout was receiving proper care. Despite his intention to review potential financial adjustments to accommodate the veterinary expenses, James found himself drifting into unconsciousness within minutes of his head touching the pillow. His dreams were fragmented scenes from distant battlefields, interspersed with images of Whiskers standing guard over Scout in the ravine. In one particularly vivid sequence, the orange cat transformed into a fellow soldier James had served with in Afghanistan, a reconnaissance specialist who had risked his life to extract a wounded local child from a firefight zone. The symbolic connection between past and present momentarily startled James to semi-wakefulness before exhaustion pulled him back under. The motel room phone's shrill ring pierced through James's sleep at 4:38 a.m., according to the glowing red digits of the bedside clock. His hand reached for the receiver with automatic precision, decades of military readiness overriding the disorientation of interrupted sleep. "Whittaker," he answered, voice clear despite the early hour. "Mr. Whittaker, this is Melissa from Callaway Veterinary Clinic." The young woman's voice carried the careful neutrality of medical professionals delivering potentially difficult news. "I wanted to inform you that Scout experienced some complications about 30 minutes ago. His temperature spiked significantly, and he showed signs of respiratory distress." James was already reaching for his prosthetic leg, military efficiency taking over as he prepared to respond to the emergency. "How serious?" "We've stabilized him for now." Dr. Callaway administered additional antibiotics and anti-inflammatory medication. "His vitals have improved, but Dr. Callaway felt you should be notified of the development." "I'll be there in 15 minutes, James stated, already calculating the most efficient sequence of actions required to dress and reach the clinic. "That's not necessary, Mr. Whittaker," Melissa assured him. "Scout is stable again. Dr. Callaway just wanted to keep you informed of his condition. Unless something changes dramatically, morning visiting hours will be sufficient." James paused in his preparations, reason overtaking the impulse for immediate action. "Understood. Please tell." "Dr. Callaway, I appreciate the update. How's Whiskers handling the situation?" A hint of amazement entered Melissa's professional tone. "That's actually part of why I'm calling. The cat, Whiskers, somehow alerted us to Scout's deteriorating condition before our monitoring equipment registered the changes. He became extremely vocal and agitated about 10 minutes before Scout's temperature spike registered on our equipment. Dr. Callaway happened to be checking on another overnight patient and noticed the behavior. He decided to examine Scout earlier than scheduled and caught the infection flare-up in its early stages. This information didn't surprise James as much as it might have. He'd witnessed enough of Whiskers' unusual behavior to accept this latest evidence of the cat's extraordinary awareness. "He's a good sergeant," James commented, the military terminology feeling oddly appropriate. "Looks after his unit." Melissa's soft laugh suggested she found the characterization both amusing and fitting. "He certainly does." Once Scout stabilized, Whiskers returned to his position on top of the kennel. He finally accepted some water and a small amount of food after Scout's condition improved. "I'll see them both at morning visiting hours," James confirmed. "Please call if there are any further developments." After ending the call, James found himself fully awake despite the early hour. Years of pre-dawn missions had conditioned his body to function on minimal sleep when necessary. Rather than attempting to return to bed, he decided to prepare for the day ahead. The Pinecone's breakfast buffet wouldn't open for another hour, but the in-room coffee maker provided sufficient caffeine to jumpstart his system. As he sipped the mediocre brew, James opened his small notebook and began calculating budget adjustments. The preliminary veterinary bill would require significant financial reorganization, perhaps selling his fishing equipment and postponing the roof repairs his cabin desperately needed before winter. Each sacrifice was noted methodically, without self-pity or regret. James had long ago learned to distinguish between wants and needs, between comfort and necessity. His military pension and disability benefits provided adequate coverage for essential expenses, but left little margin for emergency situations like Scout's medical care. By the time the first grey light of dawn appeared through the motel room curtains, James had developed a workable financial strategy. It would require careful management and elimination of most discretionary spending for several months, but remained feasible without incurring debt. A situation James avoided with almost religious dedication. The breakfast buffet proved surprisingly substantial for a motel of the Pinecone's modest caliber. James filled his plate with scrambled eggs, bacon, and whole wheat toast, nodding acknowledgement to Earl, who manned the coffee station while simultaneously checking out departing guests. "How's your animal doing over at Calloway's?" Earl inquired. As he refilled James's coffee cup, holding his own, James replied, the military phrase feeling appropriate. "Had a rough patch overnight, but stabilized." Earl nodded with the understanding of someone who had witnessed both recovery and loss. "Animals are tougher than we give them credit for. My daughter's horse, the one Calloway saved, took a fence wrong and shattered her front leg. Everyone said put her down, even the first vet we called. Calloway said she had heart, said it was worth trying. That was 4 years ago. She's still winning barrel races." The story offered a measure of hope that James accepted gratefully. "Good to hear. My rescue's a German Shepherd pup. Someone at the Veterans Retreat this weekend did a number on him, left him for dead." Earl's expression darkened, his jaw tightening visibly. "Damn shame. Some folks come back broken inside, do things they wouldn't have done before. Still no excuse for hurting something helpless." James nodded agreement, the simple moral clarity refreshing in its directness. Sheriffs getting involved, looking to identify who was responsible. "Good." Earl topped off James's coffee with a generous pour. "Brennan's solid, old-school lawman. Doesn't play politics, just follows evidence where it leads." He hesitated, then added, "You staying another night?" "Happy to extend the military rate if you need the room longer." The offer represented another small kindness that James hadn't anticipated. "Might take you up on that. Need to see how the pup's doing first." After finishing breakfast, James settled his modest bill and walked the 3 blocks to Calloway Veterinary Clinic. The morning air carried the fresh-washed scent characteristic of mountain towns after rainfall, and scattered puddles reflected the gradually brightening sky. Millridge was beginning to stir. Shopkeepers raising blinds, early morning customers forming a line outside the bakery, a postal worker sorting mail inside the small brick post office. The clinic's lights were fully illuminated when James arrived, and Jenny was already at the reception desk, her cheerful greeting suggesting she was naturally a morning person. "Dr. Calloway mentioned you'd be coming in early. Melissa told me about Scout's midnight excitement. Quite the dramatic night." "How is he this morning?" James inquired, foregoing social pleasantries in favor of direct information. "Stable and actually showing some improvement," Jenny reported, consulting her computer screen. "Temperatures back to normal range, respiratory rate steady. Dr. Calloway is cautiously optimistic." She looked up with a smile. "And your cat has become something of a clinic celebrity." Melissa took photos to document what she's calling interspecies, medical alerting behavior. She's thinking of writing it up for the veterinary journal. James didn't bother correcting the ownership assumption again. "May I see them?" "Of course. Dr. Calloway is finishing rounds, but Melissa is in the recovery area. She can update you on Scout's condition." Jenny buzzed him through the security. Door that separated the reception area from the treatment rooms. The recovery ward presented a different atmosphere from the previous evening. Daylight streamed through high windows, illuminating the row of kennels where several animals now rested, in various stages of recovery. The sounds of gentle classical music played at low volume. Mozart, James recognized from his limited musical knowledge. Melissa, a petite woman with dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail, was checking monitors beside Scout's kennel. She looked up as James approached, her expression brightening with recognition. "Mr. Whitaker, great timing. Scout just had his morning assessment and he's showing remarkable improvement overnight, despite the temporary setback." James focused first on Scout, noting with relief that the puppy's breathing appeared stronger and more regular than the previous day. The external fixation device supporting his broken leg remained in place, but the bandages around his torso had been changed to fresh white wrappings. Most encouragingly, Scout's eyes were open, still clouded with medication, but noticeably more. Alert atop the kennel, Whiskers maintained his vigilant position, though his posture appeared more relaxed. The cat acknowledged James's arrival with a slow blink before returning his attention to Scout. A small food dish and water bowl had been placed nearby, both showing signs of modest consumption. His white blood cell count is still elevated, indicating he's fighting infection, but the targeted antibiotics are working, Melissa explained, her clinical terminology occasionally interrupted by expressions of genuine admiration for Scout's resilience. He's actually taken a small amount of water directly from a syringe this morning, which is an excellent sign. Dr. Calloway thinks we might try some very soft food later today if his progress continues. Scout's tail, previously limp and unresponsive, twitched slightly as James approached the kennel. The motion was barely perceptible, but represented a significant improvement from the near-death state James had discovered in the ravine. "He recognizes you," Melissa noted with surprise. "That's remarkable, considering he was nearly unconscious during your initial interaction." "Animals have better instincts than we do," James replied, keeping his voice soft and calm. "They recognize allies." Melissa nodded agreement before continuing her update. "We've documented extensive evidence of the abuse Scout suffered. Dr. Calloway has already provided preliminary information to Sheriff Brennan. They'll likely want to interview you about the circumstances of finding him." James had anticipated this development. "I'll provide whatever information helps identify who did this." The sheriff mentioned he'd try to stop by the clinic later today. Melissa hesitated, then added, "There's one other thing you should know. We've had several calls this morning from local rescue organizations. Word about Scout's situation has spread quickly. Small-town networks in action. The Good Shepherd Foundation has already committed to covering half of Scout's surgical expenses, and Millridge Animal Advocates wants to set up a donation page to help with ongoing recovery costs." The unexpected community response caught James off guard. He had approached Scout's rescue as a solitary mission, his responsibility alone, and hadn't considered the possibility of broader support. "That's generous," he managed, uncomfortable with accepting assistance, yet recognizing the practical benefits. Melissa smiled, understanding. "It's how things work around here. When someone does the right thing, especially for a vulnerable animal, the community tends to rally. You'd be doing them a favor by accepting the help, gives people a chance to be part of something positive." Before James could respond, Dr. Calloway entered the recovery ward, clipboard in hand and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He looked up, spotting James and offering a professional nod of greeting. "Mr. Whitaker, good to see you. This morning, I see Melissa has updated you on Scout's improved condition. Given the severity of his initial injuries, his progress is quite remarkable." "Strong will to live," James commented. Dr. Calloway approached Scout's kennel carefully, observing the puppy's responses as he moved. "Indeed, and excellent support." He glanced meaningfully at Whiskers, who remained in his self-appointed guardian position. "I've consulted with several colleagues about your cat's behavior. The general consensus is that it's extraordinarily unusual, particularly given that they apparently had no prior relationship before you found them. Special circumstances create special bonds," James said, the aphorism one he'd heard repeatedly throughout his military career. "Shared survival has that effect." Dr. Calloway nodded thoughtfully at James' observation about shared survival creating special bonds. "In my years of practice, I've certainly witnessed extraordinary animal behaviors in crisis situations. Your cat, Whiskers, was it, demonstrates protective instincts that transcend typical feline responses. As if aware they were discussing him, Whiskers stretched deliberately on top of Scout's kennel, his amber eyes shifting between the humans with calculated assessment. The orange tabby's demeanor suggested a wary acceptance of their presence rather than trust, a distinction James recognized from his own difficult adjustment to civilian life. "We'd like to conduct some additional tests on Scout this morning," Dr. Calloway continued, reviewing notes on his clipboard. blood work to check infection markers, radiographs to assess internal healing, and a thorough examination of the surgical sites. With your permission, we'll sedate him lightly. Not full anesthesia, but enough to prevent pain during manipulation of the injured areas. James appreciated the veterinarian's direct approach and inclusion in the decision-making process. Whatever he needs, Doc. Excellent. Melissa will handle preparations while I see my morning appointments. We should have updated results by early afternoon. Dr. Calloway hesitated, then added with a hint of professional uncertainty. There's the matter of your cat during these procedures. Yesterday's experience suggests separating them could cause distress to both animals, but having an unrestrained cat in the treatment room presents certain challenges. Before James could respond, Melissa interjected with a practical solution. I've been thinking about that, Dr. Calloway. What if we used one of the pet carriers? We could place it on a counter with clear visibility of the treatment table, secure. Enough to contain the cat, but allowing him to maintain visual contact with Scout. Dr. Calloway considered the suggestion. That might work. Mr. Whitaker, do you think Whiskers would tolerate being confined if he could still see Scout? The question assumed a level of insight into Whiskers' psychology that James wasn't certain he possessed. The cat had demonstrated remarkable behavior, but remained fundamentally wild, a creature following instincts rather than human logic. Worth trying, James replied, studying Whiskers' alert posture, but he might need some convincing. We have about 30 minutes before we need to begin, Melissa said. Would you like to try introducing him to the carrier? He might respond better to you than to clinic staff. James nodded, accepting the responsibility. Melissa disappeared briefly, returning with a medium-sized pet carrier lined with a soft towel. She placed it on the floor near Scout's kennel. I'll get Scout's medications prepared while you work on Operation Cat Containment, she said with a smile, leaving James alone with the unlikely animal partners. James approached the situation with the strategic mindset that had served him throughout his military career, assessing variables, identifying potential resistance points, developing multiple contingency plans. Whiskers watched him from his elevated position, Whiskers twitching slightly in what James interpreted as cautious assessment. All right, Sergeant. James addressed the cat directly, keeping his voice low and conversational. New mission parameters. Scout needs additional medical intervention. Your cooperation is requested, but not optional. He positioned the carrier directly beneath Whiskers' perch, door open and facing outward. The cat leaned down slightly, sniffing the unfamiliar object with evident suspicion. Temporary containment only, James continued, reaching slowly into his pocket and extracting a package of beef jerky, the same type he'd offered Whiskers in the ravine. He tore off a small piece and placed it inside the carrier. Consider it a strategic observation post. Whiskers' attention shifted from the carrier to the jerky, his nostrils flaring as he detected the enticing scent. The cat's tail swished methodically, a sign of active consideration rather than agitation. James remained motionless, allowing Whiskers to process the situation without pressure. After nearly a minute of deliberation, Whiskers descended from the kennel in a graceful leap, landing beside the carrier rather than inside it. He circled the plastic container twice, examining it from all angles before cautiously extending his head inside to retrieve the jerky. He withdrew immediately after securing the treat, consuming it while maintaining eye contact with James. Good start, James acknowledged, but not mission completion. He extracted another, slightly larger piece of jerky and placed it deeper inside the carrier, requiring Whiskers to fully enter to retrieve it. The cat hesitated longer this time, clearly calculating risk versus reward. Scout whimpered softly from the kennel, drawing Whiskers' attention momentarily before the cat refocused on the carrier and its concealed treasure. With evident reluctance, Whiskers entered the carrier completely, his body tense and prepared for immediate retreat as he claimed the second piece of jerky. Before he could exit, James calmly closed the carrier door, securing it with practiced efficiency. The reaction was immediate. Whiskers abandoned his treat and launched himself against the carrier door, producing a rattling sound as plastic met metal. His displeasure manifested in a low, sustained growl that seemed incongruously deep for his medium-sized frame. "Temporary," James repeated firmly, maintaining eye contact with the agitated cat. "Necessary for the mission, whether through understanding or simple exhaustion." Whiskers' protests gradually subsided. He settled into a crouched position inside the carrier, amber eyes narrowed in what James interpreted as resigned disapproval rather than fear. The cat's posture remained alert, but no longer combative, a tactical retreat rather than surrender. Melissa returned to find James sitting beside the carrier, speaking quietly to its occupant, while Scout watched from his kennel with drowsy interest. "Impressive," she remarked. "Most feral cats would still be bouncing off the walls or frozen in terror." "He's not most cats," James replied simply. The treatment room presented a sterile clinical environment that contrasted sharply with the more comfortable recovery ward. Stainless steel dominated the space. Examination table, instrument trays, and monitoring equipment arranged with efficient precision. The scent of antiseptic hung in the air, sharp and chemical compared to the softer smells of the recovery kennels. Scout, now mildly sedated, lay on the examination table while Dr. Calloway and Melissa worked with coordinated efficiency. Whiskers' carrier had been positioned on a nearby counter, angled to provide clear sightlines to Scout throughout the procedure. The cat remained tense but quietly vigilant, amber eyes tracking each movement of the medical staff. James stood in the corner of the room, out of the way, but present as requested by Dr. Calloway. Sometimes having a familiar presence helps keep animals calmer, even under sedation, the veterinarian had explained. They can still sense supportive energy. The concept might have seemed absurdly metaphysical to James before his military service, but combat experience had taught him the tangible reality of unspoken connections, the invisible threads that bound soldiers in shared danger, the inexplicable awareness that sometimes meant the difference between life and death. He understood precisely what Dr. Calloway meant, even if the scientific explanation remained elusive. The examination proceeded methodically, blood drawn for testing, bandages removed and wounds assessed, gentle manipulation of limbs to check. Healing progress. Dr. Calloway narrated his findings in a quiet, professional tone that included James in the process without requiring response. Surgical sites showing excellent early granulation. Infection appears localized rather than systemic. Bone alignment maintaining well with external fixation. A pulmonary function improved significantly since yesterday. The technical assessment gradually built toward a more comprehensive picture than James had anticipated. Scout wasn't merely surviving, he was actively healing, his young body responding to treatment with remarkable resilience. Overall, I'm extremely pleased with his progress, Dr. Calloway concluded, carefully replacing the bandages around Scout's ribcage. Barring complications, we should be able to transition to oral antibiotics within 48 hours and begin discussing outpatient management options. The phrase caught James by surprise. Outpatient? You're saying he could leave the clinic soon? Dr. Calloway nodded, removing his examination gloves. Not immediately, but perhaps within 3 to 4 days, if this trajectory continues. The critical period for internal injuries appears to be resolving favorably. The external fixator will remain necessary for several weeks, but that's manageable on an outpatient basis with proper home care. The prospect of home care prompted a moment of practical recalibration for James. His modest cabin in the mountains outside Millridge was hardly equipped for rehabilitating an injured puppy. The structure itself was basic. One bedroom, combined kitchen and living area, small bathroom with temperamental plumbing. The surrounding terrain featured steep inclines and rough surfaces unsuitable for an animal with mobility limitations. What would home care involve? James asked, mentally cataloguing potential adaptations his living situation might require. Melissa answered while Dr. Calloway prepared an injection of antibiotics. Primarily wound management, medication administration, and activity restriction. The external fixator needs protection from moisture and debris. Exercise would be strictly limited until healing progresses further, essentially creating a confined recovery space where Scout can rest comfortably without risking injury to the surgical sites. James nodded, absorbing the information with the same focused attention he'd once applied to mission briefings. Each requirement represented a tactical challenge to be solved with available resources, an approach that had served him well throughout his military career and subsequent civilian life. "I'll make whatever adjustments necessary," he assured them, the decision solidifying as he spoke the words. Scout and Whiskers had unexpectedly become his responsibility, a mission that had chosen him rather than the reverse. Military discipline had taught him to accept such assignments without reservation once committed. From his observation post inside the carrier, Whiskers maintained unwavering attention on Scout throughout the examination. The cat's initial agitation had subsided, replaced by calculated vigilance. When Dr. Calloway administered the antibiotic injection, causing Scout to flinch despite sedation, Whiskers pressed closer to the carrier door, his posture tensing in response to the puppy's discomfort. "Your cat continues to demonstrate remarkable empathetic response," Dr. Calloway observed, securing a small pressure bandage over the injection site. "The interspecies connection here defies conventional behavioral expectations, particularly given their presumably brief acquaintance before you discovered them." James had been considering this anomaly himself. "Combat creates accelerated bonding," he noted, drawing from personal experience. "Shared trauma collapses normal relationship timelines. Maybe something similar happened here." Dr. Calloway considered this perspective with evident interest. "An intriguing hypothesis. The neurochemical processes underlying traumatic bonding are well documented in humans, though less studied in cross-species interactions." He carefully adjusted Scout's position on the examination table, ensuring the external fixator remained properly aligned. Whatever the mechanism, their connection appears beneficial to Scout's recovery. His vital signs consistently improve in the cat's presence. The observation confirmed James's instinctive sense that Whiskers had somehow become essential to Scout's well-being. The unlikely partnership would need to be maintained during recovery, adding another layer of complexity to the home care arrangements James now needed to develop. As the examination concluded, Scout was carefully transferred back to his recovery kennel. Melissa offered to return Whiskers to his observation post atop the kennel, but James opted to handle the task himself, sensing the cat might respond better to his familiar presence after the stress of confinement. Once they returned to the recovery ward, James placed the carrier beside Scout's kennel and calmly opened the door. Whiskers emerged with deliberate dignity rather than frantic escape, pausing to stretch each limb individually before leaping gracefully to his accustomed position above the recovering puppy. He made a point of ignoring James for several seconds, a display of feline independence that almost suggested conscious communication of mild disapproval. "Necessary for the mission, Sergeant," James reminded him quietly. "Sometimes discomfort serves the greater objective." Whiskers blinked slowly in response, then deliberately turned his attention to Scout, who had begun to stir as the sedation gradually wore off. The cat's posture shifted from dignified offense to watchful guardianship, a transition that struck James as remarkably similar to the professional compartmentalization he'd witnessed countless times among soldiers. Scouts, eyes opened fully, consciousness returning in visible stages. The puppy's gaze wandered unfocused for several moments before fixing first on Whiskers above him, then on James, standing nearby. Recognition registered in the small adjustments to Scout's expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight relaxation of tension, subtle indicators that became apparent to those who knew how to interpret canine communication. From above, Whiskers observed this exchange with characteristic feline assessment, amber eyes narrowed in what James increasingly interpreted as calculated approval rather than suspicion. The three of them, man, dog, cat, had formed an unlikely unit bound by circumstance and choice, each fulfilling roles that defied conventional expectations. The recovery ward's tranquility was interrupted by Jenny appearing at the doorway. "Mr. Whitaker, Sheriff Brennan has arrived to take your statement about Scout's situation. He's waiting in Dr. Calloway's office whenever you're ready." James nodded acknowledgement, giving Scout a final gentle pat before straightening to his full height. "I'll be there shortly." The moment had arrived to formally document what James had discovered at Campsite 17, to set in motion the official mechanisms of investigation and potential justice. The process would be familiar: statement, evidence, procedural follow-up, but carried additional weight knowing that Scout's condition now provided compelling testimony to deliberate cruelty rather than mere abandonment. As James departed the recovery ward, he glanced back at the unlikely partners. Scout had settled into a more comfortable position within his kennel, eyes heavy with medication but clearly tracking James's movement. Whiskers maintained his vigilant posture above, a self-appointed sentry whose dedication transcended natural instinct. Something significant had shifted during the morning's events, a turning point from crisis response to recovery planning, from uncertainty to cautious optimism. Scout's improving condition offered tangible hope, while the logistical challenges ahead provided James with a focused mission more meaningful than anything he'd undertaken since military retirement. Sheriff Brennan awaited his statement, the first step toward accountability for whoever had inflicted Scout's injuries. Beyond that lay the practical preparations for assuming care of both animals, modifications to his cabin, supplies, transportation arrangements. The path forward would require planning, adaptation, and resource management, familiar territory for a veteran accustomed to mission execution in challenging circumstances. James straightened his shoulders and proceeded toward Dr. Calloway's office, his stride reflecting the renewed purpose that had unexpectedly entered his life. The mission parameters had changed, evolving from emergency rescue to long-term rehabilitation. The objective remained clear: ensure Scout's recovery while maintaining the unusual bond between puppy and cat that seemed instrumental to healing. For the first time since military retirement had thrust him into an uncertain civilian existence, James felt the clarifying focus of purpose restored, not through combat or crisis, but through the unexpected responsibility of nurturing life rather than surviving death. Sheriff Daniel Brennan occupied Dr. Calloway's office chair with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to commanding spaces. At 58, his broad shoulders remained impressive despite the slight thickening around his midsection that spoke of too many hours behind a desk. The silver at his temples contrasted with still dark eyebrows that drew together in concentration as James recounted discovering Scout in the ravine near Campsite 17. "And you're certain the puppy wasn't there the previous day during the veterans' retreat activities?" Sheriff Brennan asked, making careful notes in a leather-bound notebook rather than the electronic tablets his younger deputies preferred. "Affirmative," James replied. "I participated in the morning hike that passed that same ravine. Would have noticed a distressed animal." He hesitated, then added the detail that had been troubling him since the discovery. The tarp covering Scout wasn't randomly placed. Someone deliberately concealed him from casual observation. The sheriff's pen paused mid-sentence, his expression darkening. Premeditated abandonment, then. Not a heat-of-the-moment situation or accident. He made additional notes before looking up. Dr. Calloway shared his preliminary medical assessment. In his opinion, the injuries were inflicted 12 to 18 hours before you found Scout. That places the timing squarely during the veterans' retreat. James nodded, the timeline aligning with his own estimates. The retreat had approximately 30 participants. Most departed Sunday morning, though a few stayed for the optional fishing expedition at Crescent Lake. "I'll need a roster of attendees," Sheriff Brennan said, flipping to a new page in his notebook. "The event coordinator should have registration records. Captain Lawrence Mendez coordinated this year," James provided. "Retired Marine Corps, lives in Bristol, has the complete participant list." The sheriff made note of the name before shifting to a more personal line of questioning. "You mentioned returning to the campsite for forgotten medication, heart medication specifically, correct? Military disability related." James didn't elaborate further, disliking the implicit vulnerability in discussing his health conditions. Sheriff Brennan seemed to sense this reluctance and didn't press for details. Fortunate timing for the puppy. According to Dr. Calloway, Scout wouldn't have survived another night without intervention. He closed his notebook, tucking it into his uniform shirt pocket. "I understand you're planning to take responsibility for him?" "Affirmative," James confirmed, "and the cat." A hint of surprise crossed the sheriff's weathered features. "The stray that was with the puppy. Calloway mentioned something unusual about their interaction but didn't elaborate." "They've formed a connection," James explained, finding the clinical description inadequate but unsure how to convey the depth of what he'd observed. "Whiskers, the cat, has been instrumental in Scout's recovery process. Medical staff confirmed it." Sheriff Brennan accepted this information with a pragmatic nod. "Animals often know things we don't. My canine partner from my state police days, Belgian, Malinois named Rex, could sense seizures before they happened. No training for it, just natural instinct." He rose from the chair, extending his hand to James. "I appreciate your detailed statement. We'll be pursuing this aggressively. Animal cruelty of this nature often indicates deeper issues." James shook the offered hand, recognizing the firm grip of someone who understood that such gestures still carried meaning. "Will you keep me updated on the investigation?" "Count on it," Sheriff Brennan assured him. "I may have additional questions as we identify persons of interest, and—" He hesitated slightly, his official demeanor softening momentarily. "As a fellow veteran, I want to say I appreciate what you're doing for Scout. Too many of us come back carrying darkness. Good to see someone fighting it by bringing in some light." The unexpected acknowledgement caught James off guard, uncomfortable with praise for what he considered necessary action rather than exceptional behavior. "Just did what needed doing," he replied, the simple phrase serving as both acknowledgement and deflection. Sheriff Brennan smiled slightly, recognizing the characteristic response. "Always the way with the best ones," he commented, then shifted back to professional mode. "I'll be in touch soon. Give that puppy my regards." After Sheriff Brennan's departure, James returned to the recovery ward where Dr. Calloway was conducting his midday assessment of Scout. The veterinarian looked up as James entered, his expression cautiously optimistic. "Latest blood work shows infection markers decreasing significantly," Dr. Calloway reported. "Respiratory function continues to improve, and he's maintaining appropriate hydration levels through the IV. We're going to attempt some soft food this afternoon, another important milestone if he tolerates it." James observed Scout's condition with a critical eye, noting the improved alertness and stronger tail movement when the puppy recognized his approach. "He seems more responsive today." "Remarkably so," Dr. Calloway agreed. Young animals often demonstrate astonishing recovery capabilities when given appropriate support. The first 72 hours are typically most critical with traumatic injuries. We're approaching that threshold with increasingly positive indicators. Throughout the examination, Whiskers maintained his vigilant position atop the kennel, amber eyes tracking Dr. Calloway's every movement, but without the tension that had characterized his earlier observations. The cat had apparently assessed the veterinarian as non-threatening, a significant evolution in his behavior toward clinic staff. "Your cat has become something of a celebrity among our team," Dr. Calloway mentioned, making notes on Scout's chart. "Melissa has been documenting his behavior patterns for a potential case study on interspecies bonding in trauma recovery." "With your permission, of course." James nodded agreement, seeing no reason to object to research that might benefit other animals. "She's welcome to document whatever helps." "Excellent. Now, regarding Scout's ongoing care," Dr. Calloway hung the chart at the end of the kennel before continuing, "I'd like to discuss transition planning. Assuming his positive trajectory continues, we could consider releasing him to home care as early as Thursday. That would give us 2 more days of controlled observation while transitioning from IV to oral medications." The timeline was more accelerated than James had anticipated, creating an immediate need to prepare his cabin for Scout's arrival. What specific accommodations would he require? Dr. Calloway outlined the necessary arrangements with clinical thoroughness: a confined recovery space with soft bedding, elevated food and water dishes to minimize movement, a protected area for the external fixator, regular medication administration, and wound care protocols. Each requirement represented a specific modification to James's current living situation. "And the cat?" James inquired, glancing at Whiskers, who seemed to be listening to the conversation with characteristic intensity. "That's an interesting question," Dr. Calloway acknowledged. "From a strictly medical perspective, introducing a stray cat to a home environment with an immunocompromised puppy would normally be contraindicated due to potential disease transmission. However, given their established relationship and the apparent benefits to Scout's recovery process, separation could potentially cause stress that might impede healing." The veterinarian adjusted his glasses, considering the unusual circumstances. "I would recommend having Whiskers examined and vaccinated before bringing him into your home. We could perform a basic health assessment this afternoon if you'd like. Check for parasites, FIV, general condition. Assuming no significant health concerns are identified, the benefits of maintaining their bond likely outweigh the theoretical risks." James agreed to Whiskers' examination, though he harbored doubts about how the independent cat would respond to veterinary handling. To his surprise, Whiskers submitted to the procedure with unexpected cooperation, tolerating blood draws and physical examination with stoic resignation, rather than the aggressive resistance typical of feral cats. "He's in remarkably good condition for a stray," Dr. Calloway reported after completing the assessment. "No signs of FIV or other communicable diseases, minimal parasite burden, good musculature, clear eyes and ears. I'd estimate he's approximately 3 to 4 years old based on dentition. He's been surviving quite efficiently in the wild." The examination confirmed what James had instinctively recognized in Whiskers: a fellow survivor who had adapted to challenging circumstances through resilience and resourcefulness. The parallel between the cat's self-reliant existence and James's own post-military adjustment didn't escape his notice. With Whiskers' health assessment complete and Scout's care plan established, James turned his attention to preparing for their eventual homecoming. The logistical challenges required immediate action, purchasing necessary supplies, modifying his cabin's interior, arranging transportation suitable for an injured puppy and a recently wild cat. "I need to make some preparations at my place," James informed Dr. Calloway. "We'll be gone for a few hours, but back before evening rounds." The veterinarian nodded, understanding. "Scout will primarily be resting today as his body continues healing. Melissa will attempt the first soft food feeding around 2 o'clock. You're welcome to return whenever your preparations allow." James approached Scout's kennel for a brief farewell, allowing the puppy to sniff his hand through the bars. Scout's tail wagged with increasing strength, a promising sign of improving vitality. Above, Whiskers observed the interaction with characteristic attentiveness before deliberately closing his eyes in what feline experts often described as a slow blink of trust. Carrying on with mission preparations, James told them both, the simple explanation feeling appropriate despite the obvious impossibility of their comprehension. "We'll return before nightfall." The Millridge Hardware and Farm Supply Store occupied a sprawling single-story building at the edge of town, its wide aisles stocked with an eclectic range of merchandise that reflected the diverse needs of the mountain community. James entered with a mental checklist of required items, immediately heading toward the animal care section. Harold Buchanan, the store's owner for over 40 years, intercepted James midway down the aisle. At 73, Harold moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had earned the right to take his time. His wire-rimmed glasses perched perpetually at the end of his nose. "Heard you're the one who rescued that abused shepherd pup out at Whispering Pines," Harold said without preamble. "Mountain communities being characterized by efficient information networks. Damn shame what happened to that animal. Sheriff Brennan was in earlier, mentioned you're taking the pup home soon." James nodded, unsurprised by how quickly news traveled in Millridge. "Setting up a recovery space at my cabin, need some supplies." Harold's expression brightened with purpose. "Got just about everything on Dr. Calloway's standard list for injured animals. Helped outfit 3 recovery spaces this past year alone. Jackson's hound after the porcupine incident, Miller's barn cat caught in that illegal trap, and old Mrs. Harmon's retriever when it tangled with something in the national forest." The efficiency of small-town knowledge saved considerable explanation. Harold led James through the store, helping him select appropriate items: a large dog bed with orthopedic foam, washable waterproof covers, stainless steel elevated feeding, dishes, baby gates for creating confined recovery spaces, and specialized cleaning supplies safe for wound care environments. As they gathered the supplies, Harold provided running commentary on each product, offering insights from previous customers' experiences. "These gates work better than the plastic ones, more stable if the dog leans against them. And this bedding cover can be bleached without falling apart. Learned that lesson with the Miller situation." When they reached the pet food section, Harold paused thoughtfully. "Calloway usually recommends the Hills Science diet for recovering pups, easy to digest and supports immune function. For cats," he glanced at James with raised eyebrows. "Also need cat supplies," James confirmed, taking in the stray that found the puppy. Harold's weathered face registered surprise before settling into appreciation. 2 rescues, then. Good man. He selected several premium cat food options, along with basic feline necessities: litter box, scoop, scratching post, and feeding dishes. Cat toys might help keep it occupied while the pup recovers, less likely to bother the injured animal if it has distractions. James accepted the suggestion, adding several simple toys to the growing collection of supplies. By the time they reached the checkout counter, his selections filled an entire flatbed cart, a substantial investment in Scout and Whiskers' future well-being. Harold examined the accumulated items with professional assessment. Building quite the recovery suite there. Anything else you're needing for the cabin itself? Weather stripping, heater maintenance supplies? Calendar says winter's still a ways off, but mountain weather plays by its own rules. The question prompted James to consider his cabin's general condition, the leaking roof, drafty windows, and temperamental plumbing that he'd been addressing through gradual repairs as finances permitted. Taking on Scout's care would delay those improvements further, but the priority hierarchy seemed clear. Roof repair will have to wait, James replied, more to himself than to Harold. Focus on interior comfort for now. Harold nodded understanding, having witnessed the practical trade-offs many mountain residents made between necessary improvements and available resources. Might want to consider some of these insulated curtains for wherever you're setting up the recovery space. Help maintain consistent temperature without overtaxing your heating system. James added the recommended curtains to his purchases, appreciating the practical advice. As Harold calculated the total, the final figure represented a significant portion of James's monthly income, an investment in Scout and Whiskers that would require additional budget adjustments beyond those already planned. The Good Shepherd Foundation left a credit here for you, Harold mentioned as he processed the payment. Said to apply it towards supplies for the rescued German Shepherd. Covers about half your total today. The unexpected assistance momentarily caught James off guard, a second instance of community support he hadn't anticipated. Wasn't aware they'd done that. Harold shrugged slightly. That's Millridge for you. Folks here believe in supporting good actions, not charity exactly, more like community investment. When someone steps up to help, others tend to reinforce it. He finished processing the transaction with practiced efficiency. Need help loading all this into your truck? With the supplies secured in his Ford pickup, James made a final stop at the Millridge Pharmacy to refill his heart medication. The original reason for his return to Whispering Pines that had ultimately led to Scout's rescue. The synchronicity of these events wasn't lost on him, though he hesitated to assign meaning beyond simple coincidence. As he drove the winding mountain road toward his cabin, the afternoon sun filtered through autumn-tinged foliage, casting dappled shadows across the truck's hood. The peaceful scene contrasted sharply with the urgency that had characterized the previous day's journey along the same route, with a dying puppy and wary cat as unexpected passengers. James's cabin appeared on the horizon, a modest structure nestled among towering pines on a small clearing overlooking a steep ravine. Built originally as a hunting lodge in the 1950s, the cabin featured a covered porch, wood-shingled roof currently patched in several places with tarpaulin, and rustic charm that masked various structural compromises James had adapted to since purchasing the property 4 years earlier. The interior reflected his minimalist lifestyle, functional furniture, sparse decorations limited primarily to military memorabilia and practical items, and a general emphasis on utility over aesthetics. The main room combined kitchen and living areas, with a small bedroom and basic bathroom extending from the rear. A wood stove provided primary heating, supplemented by electric baseboard units for particularly cold nights. James unloaded the supplies methodically, arranging them in the main room before assessing potential recovery space locations. The bedroom offered the most consistent temperature and fewest drafts, though using it for Scout would require James to sleep on the couch, a minor inconvenience compared to the benefits for recovery. Over the next 3 hours, he transformed the bedroom into a rehabilitation environment that met Dr. Calloway's specifications. The bed was pushed against one wall, creating open floor space for Scout's oversized orthopedic dog bed. Baby gates were installed in the doorway, creating a confined area that would restrict movement while allowing visual connection to the main living space. The existing bedside table was repurposed as a feeding station, positioned at the ideal height for Scout's access without straining his injuries. Waterproof pads covered strategic floor areas, anticipating accidents during Scout's limited mobility phase. The insulated curtains now hung over previously bare windows, improving temperature regulation throughout the space. For Whiskers, James created a separate territory that acknowledged the cat's need for vertical vantage points. A scratching post was positioned near the window, offering observation opportunities while providing necessary claw maintenance. The litter box was discreetly placed in the bathroom, with the door modified to remain partially open while preventing Scout's access. With the interior preparations complete, James turned his attention to transport considerations. Scout's external fixator would require protection during the journey from Millridge to the cabin, particularly on the unpaved section of access road that inevitably created significant vehicle jostling. James constructed a makeshift stabilization system using spare bedding and bungee cords that would secure Scout's crate to the truck's seat while minimizing movement. For Whiskers, he modified a pet carrier with additional ventilation holes and a more substantial interior cushion, anticipating the cat's potential stress during vehicular confinement. As sunset approached, James conducted a final inspection of the preparations, mentally comparing the modified living space against Dr. Calloway's requirements. The transformation was substantial. His previously Spartan bachelor quarters now resembled a specialized recovery facility, the changes representing both practical necessity and deeper commitment to his unexpected dependence. The entire process had activated dormant aspects of James's military training: logistical planning, resource allocation, and environment modification for specific mission parameters. The familiar mental framework provided a comforting structure for approaching this unfamiliar responsibility, allowing him to apply proven problem-solving methodologies to his new civilian mission. With preparations complete, James secured the cabin and began the return journey to Millridge Veterinary Clinic. The established routine of the drive, winding mountain roads, transitioning to small-town streets, already felt different, weighted with the anticipation of eventually making this same journey with Scout and Whiskers as permanent rather than temporary passengers. Throughout the transformation process, James had maintained focus on practical matters, deliberately avoiding deeper examination of the emotional implications. Yet as he approached Millridge, the magnitude of his commitment became increasingly apparent. He had restructured his living space, reallocated financial resources, and reorganized daily routines, all for animals he had known less than 48 hours. The depth of this investment transcended logical explanation. Military training emphasized rational decision-making based on strategic objectives, yet James struggled to articulate the strategic purpose behind his actions. The rescue had begun as emergency response, clear-cut and justifiable, but had evolved into something more complex and personal that defied simple categorization. As the veterinary clinic came into view, illuminated by exterior lights against the darkening evening sky, James acknowledged what he had been avoiding throughout the preparation process. Scout and Whiskers had somehow become significant to him beyond mere responsibility. Their unexpected entrance into his carefully controlled post-military existence had disrupted established patterns in ways both challenging and oddly fulfilling. The realization wasn't entirely comfortable for someone accustomed to emotional compartmentalization, but it was undeniably true. James parked his truck, taking a moment to center himself before entering the clinic where Scout and Whiskers awaited his return. Two unlikely survivors who had unexpectedly become central elements in his own continuing survival story. 3 months had passed since that fateful day at Campsite 17. Winter had settled over the mountains surrounding Mill Ridge, blanketing James's cabin in pristine white that contrasted sharply with the warm scene inside. Scout, no longer the fragile puppy from the ravine, bounded through the living room with the exuberance of youth, his surgical scars hidden beneath a glossy coat that had filled out with proper nutrition. The external fixator had been removed 6 weeks earlier, and though he still favored his previously broken leg slightly when tired, Dr. Calloway had pronounced his recovery nothing short of miraculous. From his perch on the windowsill, Whiskers observed Scout's playful circles with characteristic feline assessment, amber eyes tracking the puppy's movement while maintaining dignified detachment. The orange tabby had established clear boundaries within their shared home. Certain surfaces remained exclusively his territory, while others were reluctantly shared. James watched their interaction from his armchair, a cup of coffee warming his hands as snow fell outside. The cabin had undergone further transformation since their arrival, roof finally repaired thanks to an unexpected donation from the Veteran Support Alliance. Interior spaces gradually adapted to accommodate both animals' needs, and an overall shift from utilitarian bachelor quarters to something increasingly resembling a home. Sheriff Brennan's investigation had identified the person responsible for Scout's injuries. A retreat participant named Marcus Jennings, who had brought the puppy illegally to the campsite and, in an alcohol-fueled rage, had brutally attacked the animal before attempting to conceal the evidence. Security footage from the camp store had captured Jennings purchasing the tarp used to cover Scout, and DNA evidence from cigarette butts found near the ravine matched the distinctive burns on the puppy's body. Jennings now faced felony animal cruelty charges, with his case complicated by revelations of previous domestic violence incidents. The Veterans Retreat Organization had implemented stricter screening procedures and mandatory sobriety requirements for future participants, policy changes that acknowledged how untreated trauma could manifest in destructive behaviors, while refusing to accept such actions as inevitable or excusable. The community's response had continued to surprise James. Harold from the hardware store regularly set aside premium pet food when it went on sale. Melissa from the veterinary clinic stopped by weekly, ostensibly to check Scout's recovery, but increasingly staying for coffee and conversation. Even Earl from the Pinecone Motel occasionally appeared with leftover breakfast sausages for the animals. Though James noticed Scout and Whiskers received equal portions despite Earl's claimed preference for dogs. The doorbell rang, a recent installation that had initially terrified both animals, but now elicited excited recognition from Scout and strategic repositioning from Whiskers. James opened the door to find Dr. Calloway stamping snow from his boots, medical bag in hand, for Scout's final post-recovery evaluation. "Quite the winter wonderland out there," the veterinarian remarked, entering the warm cabin. "How's our miracle patient today?" Scout answered the question himself, racing to greet the visitor with enthusiastic tail wagging and none of the fear that might be expected after extensive medical interventions. Dr. Calloway knelt to properly acknowledge the puppy, now nearly quadruple his original weight and developing the distinctive shoulders and confident posture of a mature German Shepherd. "Remarkable progress," Dr. Calloway noted, conducting his examination as Scout cooperated with practiced patience. Full range of motion in the healed leg, excellent muscle development, no signs of lasting trauma from the internal injuries. He glanced up at James. "You've done extraordinary work with his rehabilitation." James shook his head slightly. "Team effort. Couldn't have done it without Whiskers." He nodded toward the cat, who maintained careful surveillance from his elevated position. "He's been Scout's physical therapist since day one." The statement wasn't hyperbole. Throughout Scout's recovery, Whiskers had demonstrated uncanny awareness of the puppy's needs, encouraging movement when appropriate through strategic placement of himself just beyond Scout's comfortable reach, discouraging overexertion through gentle but firm intervention, and providing a consistent, calming presence during painful rehabilitation exercises. Dr. Calloway completed his assessment, making final notes in Scout's medical record. "I'm officially declaring Scout fully recovered. He'll always have those scars, and he might experience some stiffness in cold weather as he ages, but otherwise, he's a perfectly healthy dog with a normal life expectancy." The pronouncement represented a definitive milestone, the successful completion of the mission James had unexpectedly accepted that rainy afternoon in the ravine. Scout had not merely survived, he had thrived, transformed from a broken, dying creature into a vibrant companion whose playful spirit showed no lasting damage from his traumatic beginning. After Dr. Calloway's departure, James stood at the window watching snow accumulate on the newly replaced roof. Scout pressed against his leg, seeking attention, while Whiskers observed from the nearby bookshelf the unlikely family they had become through extraordinary circumstances. That evening, as James prepared dinner, now a more elaborate affair than his previous bachelor meals, he found himself reflecting on the unexpected changes of the past 3 months. Military service had taught him that meaning often emerged from adversity, that purpose could be forged in responding to the unplanned and unwelcome. Yet finding that principle actively demonstrated in civilian life had proven transformative in ways he hadn't anticipated. Scout and Whiskers had entered his carefully controlled existence as responsibilities, problems to solve, missions to complete. Their gradual evolution into companions represented something more profound than simple pet ownership. They had reconnected James to aspects of himself that military transition had buried: capacity for nurturing, appreciation for small joys, and the quiet satisfaction of witnessing healing rather than destruction. Sater, as James settled into his armchair with a book, Scout curled at his feet while Whiskers claimed the adjacent cushion, he recognized the simple truth that had emerged. From their unlikely journey together, the act of rescuing had created something essential for all three of them. Not just physical healing for Scout, not just shelter for Whiskers, but a restoration of connection that transcended species barriers. In the ravine at Whispering Pines, death had seemed the inevitable outcome until an orange cat defied natural instinct to protect a dying puppy. That single act of unexpected compassion had rippled outward, touching James, the clinic staff, the Millridge community and beyond, a reminder that even in darkness, the capacity for light remained. Outside, snow continued falling, covering the mountain in pristine white, while inside the cabin, warmth and companionship flourished. An unlikely family forged through trauma and compassion, healing together in ways that none could have achieved alone.